Our banking system is sound.
In the past 2 weeks, serious difficulties at a small number of banks have emerged.
These banks are safe.
All depositors' savings in the banking system are safe.
The banking system in the United States is sound and resilient.
Banking system is sound. Banking system is sound. Banking system is sound. Banking system is sound and resilient.
A rough week for the banking industry.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the second biggest bank collapse in U.S. history.
The Silicon Valley Bank collapse is the worst since 2008.
Social Security is structurally sound.
As president, I will not cut one penny from Social Security or Medicare.
There's an imminent disaster waiting. I mean, that's where we're headed.
2 balls, 2 strikes to Bryce Harper. Suarez delivers. Swing and a drive. Left field. It's deep. It's going. Yes! And it is gone. Yes! It is bedlam at the bank as Bryce Harper has put the Phillies on top.
Thank you for tuning in to podcast number 5 of Bogus Banks, Behemoth Bubbles, and Baseball Betting. I'm your host, Chase Goldman, and today is Tuesday, November 11th, also known as Veterans Day. So happy Veterans Day, everyone. Want to go back and just correct one thing that I had wrong in last week's episode. My son had sent me a text message of a meme about Will Smith having won the World Series for 6 years in a row. I looked it up. And I should have fact-checked this before I put it in the podcast last week. But Will Smith, the catcher for the Dodgers, has been with the Dodgers every year for the last 6 years. So it is true that a Will Smith has been on the World Series championship team 6 years in a row. But the other guy is a reliever. He was with the Braves when they won the World Series in 2021. He was with the Astros when they won the World Series in 22, and then he's with the Rangers in 23. So between the two of them, there has been a Will Smith that's been on the World Series championship team for 6 years in a row, but it's not the same guy. So I just want to correct that and get that out there. You guys should be fact-checking me on everything that I claim, but I understand you hear things on podcasts and you tend to believe them. But anyway, today I just want to go over and give you an update on last week's podcast. Nobody rings a bell. This is part 2, and the trade is still alive by just by a thread. So I'll refresh your memory. Last week, Andrew Ross Sorkin had come out on the morning of October the 28th and rang the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange, standing in front of a giant sign about a stock market crash. Now the official reason that he did that was that he wrote a book about the 1929 stock market crash, and he was promoting his book. Okay, so that's why he stood there on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in front of a giant sign about a stock market crash. Now, 2 things about that. Number one, I was thinking about this after last week's podcast, after I recorded that. The following day, all 3 major U.S. stock market indexes, the NASDAQ 100, the Dow, and the S&P 500, all 3 of them hit new record all-time intraday highs. And that would have been on October the 29th, the day after he rang the bell. That was on a Wednesday. Now, if you ask Google when was the stock market crash of 1929, it's going to tell you it was October. Even though the market peaked on September 3rd, everybody knows that the market really crashed in October of 29. So October of 1929 would be 10/29. Andrew Ross Sorkin rings the opening bell of the stock market in front of a giant sign about a stock market crash. Remember the old saying, nobody rings a bell? Well, he was standing in front of that sign, and the next day was October the 29th, when all 3 major indexes hit their all-time intraday highs, 10/29. So the Dow came very, very close to breaking that all-time intraday high today. It came within, I think, 15 points is what I saw. I was watching it late towards the close on Trading Economics. It came within 15 points of breaking a new record all-time intraday high. The Dow was up like 600 points today. And now I shorted NASDAQ because I feel like that's the more volatile index. And if there's a market crash, that's the one I want to be short. I don't want to be short Dow. NASDAQ's going to drop faster and more, in my opinion. But I think the reason that the Dow was, because the thing, I felt like the thing that weighed down the NASDAQ 100 today, because it was in the red, it went down 40, 50 points today, whereas the Dow was up 600 points. And I think the reason for that was primarily just NVIDIA. So when they added NVIDIA to the Dow, remember, if you got 30 stocks in the Dow, and if you're going to kick one out, kick one of the components out and replace it with a different one that you think is a better company, if that one that's getting kicked out only represents 1% of the index, then when you put NVIDIA into that index, it can only represent 1%. You can't have it represent more than 1% of the component that was kicked out. So because they added NVIDIA so late, that would be, I think that's, I just think NVIDIA doesn't make up that much of the Dow the way it does with the NASDAQ 100. So there's that. Another thing I want to point out, if there was a poster child for the 2000 stock market crash. Now remember, in that one, I think the NASDAQ went down like, I want to say it was 87%. It was a massive amount. It was over 80% for sure. If there is a poster child for the .com stock market crash, it would have to be, in my opinion, Enron. That is the one that everybody thinks of first and foremost, Enron, Kenneth Lay. Interestingly enough, when the S&P 500 had Enron go bankrupt, they had to replace it with another stock, and what do you think that stock was? It was NVIDIA. Now, I listen to Jack Campbell every morning on Nobody's Special Finance. I think he's really sharp. He does a lot of good research, and I trust his research. He expects Jensen Huang to be arrested and put in handcuffs at some point. Now, I believe that NVIDIA is running a fraud. I don't know if they're going to go bankrupt. I don't know if I'd say that, but I do think that this circular accounting that's going on, where NVIDIA's customer is NVIDIA, and this just goes, I mean, it's so persistent throughout that whole entire AI bubble. Oh my God. But I turned on CNBC for, 20 minutes this morning, yesterday morning. I've watched a lot more CNBC recently than I normally do. And one thing I've noticed is the narrative, when the market was down early on Friday, it was down like, I think NASDAQ was down about 400 points. They were all talking about how it's not a bubble. The AI is not in a bubble. This is going to grow. Everything. Just stay tight, guys. Don't sell. That was the sermon they were preaching on CNBC. So today the Dow did come, extremely close to hitting a new all-time intraday high. It did hit a new record all-time closing daily high, but it fell short of the new record intraday high by about 15 points. So I'm still alive on this trade, but I will tell you that if the Dow breaches and sets a new record all-time intraday high, I am going to close out my shorts because I feel like my thesis isn't playing out. Okay. Now, it might be that we'll look back and the weekly candle was the thing I should have been watching, or maybe even the monthly, but I'm not going to stay short this stupid bull market very long at all. I mean, once I get one red flag, I'm pretty much out of this trade. So I think I'm going to wind up losing the bet. I'll lose a little bit of money. It won't be much. Fortunately, NASDAQ didn't go up that much today. But I just wanted to spend some more time on the podcast today talking about why crazy Chase Goldman is seeing things that may or may not be there. And we might find out tomorrow that Chase Goldman was wrong. Okay. But I just wanted to spend the rest of this podcast explaining to you guys why crazy Chase Goldman might not be all that crazy after all, when you hear this laundry list of things that just like, if these little snippets and stories that I'm about to go over don't make you scratch your head, I don't know what to tell you. Okay, so we're going to go back up. Now, some of these are going to be a review from last week, and some of them are going to be brand new. But let's start with, and I kind of put these in the order of the weirdness that I think they are. Okay, so the first one is number 1. Dean Koontz and the Eyes of Darkness. This book was written in 1981 by Dean Koontz, the famous author back in the 80s. It's about a worldwide pandemic that was started when a virus escapes from a bioweapons lab. The lab just so happens to be in China, but it wasn't in Shanghai, it wasn't in Beijing, it was in none other than Wuhan, China. Not only that, this book, written in 1981, was set in the future. Can you guess what year the book was set in? That's right. It was set in the year 2020. Wow, what a coincidence. Okay. Ingersoll Lockwood. Okay. This guy was an author. He wrote 3 books that I am concerned about. The first 2 were written in 1890 and in 1893. Both featured a character named Baron Trump, who was mentored by a guy named Don. Okay. He wrote another book in 1896. The title of this one was The Last President, where a populist outsider from New York City wins the presidential election just before the collapse of the American Republic. And for those of you that might not be aware, Donald Trump has a son named Barron today. Okay, Bart to the Future. This episode aired on March 19th, 2000. In this episode, Lisa Simpson is elected president. She stands on the inauguration making her speech, and she says, "Thanks to the economic disaster left behind for us by President Trump." And then she says, "How bad is it?" Milhouse comes running in with a chart of a crashing stock market. He says, "We're broke." Okay, that was 16 years before Trump was elected president. Let's go with Heavy Metal Magazine. Now, I actually ordered this one. I have this magazine sitting on my coffee table in my house. Heavy Metal Magazine, the July issue, 1990. Now, when I ordered this magazine, I thought it was going to be, like I had some magazines when I was a kid growing up, about Cinderella and Rat and the hair bands of the 80s. That's not what this was about. It was just one little cartoon that took up 5 or 6 pages after another after another. It was all just stupid random cartoons. But there was one cartoon in there that talked about Donald Trump building a wall. This is 26 years before he became president and started building a wall. Okay? This next one is really weird. It's about the wreck of the Titan. The Wreck of the Titan by Morgan Robertson, published in 1898. The Titan was in this book, the Titan was the world's largest ship. It was 800 feet and displaced 45,000 tons. Now, the name sounds a lot like Titanic, doesn't it? The Wreck of the Titan sounds a lot like the Titanic. Now, the Titanic was 882 feet and it displaced 46,000 tons. In other words, both of these ships were almost exactly the same size. Both of them were the largest, most luxurious ocean liners ever built, and both of them were touted as unsinkable. Both of them carried elite dignitaries like senators and stuff like that. Both of them struck an iceberg. Both of the collisions occurred on the starboard side of the ship. Both of these ships, the one in the book and the Titanic in real life, both had, as you know, way too few lifeboats for that many passengers. The routes were nearly identical. The Titan left New York City bound for England. The Titanic left England bound for New York City. Both ships sank at about the same place in the North Atlantic. Both disasters occurred in the month of April, and with both stories there was massive loss of life. So, wow, what a coincidence. This one, I've heard Joe Rogan go over this one. Lincoln and Kennedy. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. Lincoln had 4 children and one of them died while he was president. Kennedy had 4 children and one of them died while he was president. Lincoln was shot in the head by an assassin. Kennedy was shot in the head by an assassin. Lincoln's assassin was killed by gunshot. Kennedy's assassin was killed by gunshot. Lincoln was shot in a Ford, the Ford Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Ford. Lincoln, Ford, Mercury dealers, right? Same company. Lincoln's assassin shot him in a theater and fled to a warehouse. Now, full disclosure, that warehouse was a tobacco barn, but I would call it a warehouse for tobacco. All right. Kennedy's assassin shot him from a warehouse and fled to a theater. Lincoln was succeeded by Vice President Johnson. Kennedy was succeeded by Vice President Johnson. Okay. The Mars Project. Written by Werner von Braun in 1948. This is about a group of people who colonize Mars, and they encounter humanoid inhabitants. These humanoid Martians that lived on Mars were governed by a 10-member governing council, and the leader of the council was known as the Elon. Wow, what a coincidence. Kobe Bryant, went over this one on the last one, but I'll go over it again. Legends of Chamberlain Heights. That's one of those adult cartoons, kind of like The Simpsons, where in an episode in 2016, Kobe Bryant dies in a helicopter crash. So then 4 years later, the biggest news cycle before COVID came out, or the last big news cycle, Kobe Bryant actually died in a helicopter crash. And then weirdly, 3 weeks after that, maybe 2, the talking heads on CNBC were taking it seriously and literally pounding the table saying we need helicopter money. Now, prior to that, helicopter money was just, it was a mockery of the Fed and just the stupidity of just, hey, let's just print money and give it to everybody. I mean, it's a horrible economic policy. But they were literally pounding the table saying we need this right now. That's the only thing that's going to save our system. We need helicopter money. In fact, they had a term for Ben Bernanke, and they called him Helicopter Ben. It was a derogatory term about him. Veterans Day. Today is Veterans Day, so we'll go over this one. This one is really fascinating also. Now, I was always taught growing up that the Treaty of Versailles is what ended World War I. Actually, it was the Armistice signing, the Armistice Treaty. That's really what ended World War I. In fact, in 1919, I can't remember who the president was, but he declared that this is going to be, a National Day of Remembrance. The treaty was signed in 1918. A year later, November 11th, which is Veterans Day today, they called it Armistice Day. So it was Armistice Day all the way up until 1954. And in fact, in 1938, Congress voted to make Armistice Day a federal holiday. And then in 1954, they decided to rename Armistice Day Veterans Day. Okay, so that's the same holiday, and it's on November 11th. So Archduke Ferdinand, this guy was driving around in a motorcade in 1914 in Sarajevo when he was shot. I don't know if he was shot in the head, but he was assassinated. And everybody says that that's what started World War I. Okay, and that car that he was in is in a museum today. And let me check my notes. It's the Museum of Military History in Vienna. So the license plate on that car, I believe it's still on that car today. The license plate, the number on the plate is A111118. Now remember, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in 1914. The license plate on the car read A111118. In other words, Armistice, November 11th, 1918. A111118. Do you get it? Okay, well, that's a weird one. I have a hard time with that one as well. Let's look at the last man on Earth, okay? Because remember, the pandemic in 2020 was a total surprise to everyone. But a Fox TV series aired between 2015 and 18 was set in the year 2020, a year after a virus killed nearly everyone on Earth. I don't watch TV, so I never saw it. Maybe some of you guys remember it. But there were scenes in the movie, flashbacks, that showed people wearing masks and using hand sanitizers during the outbreak. So that's weird. Okay. Batman and Robin. We talked about this one a little bit last week, but I've done some more research on it. They have since altered this episode of The Family Guy. So it's very. I was not able to find the original footage, but I know I saw it about the time all this was going on. So The Family Guy's the main character in The Family Guy. In case you guys don't watch it, I never really did, but I've learned the main character is a guy named Peter. He's the guy with balls on his chin. Okay, so in this episode, Peter is watching television, and there's a roast of Robin Williams, and Peter gets mad, and he runs outside, and he's a huge Robin Williams fan, and he shouts at the top of his lungs out in the street in front of his house, "I wish everyone were Robin Williams." And then he immediately gets struck by lightning. And in this episode, then everybody that he touches turns into Robin Williams. So in the episode, he starts to lose his mind because everybody and everything's turning into Robin Williams around him, and it's driving him insane. So he tries to commit suicide. So he grabs a noose, and the noose turns into Robin Williams. He also tried to grab like a knife, and there were some other things that he attempted suicide on that turned into Robin Williams. But one of them was a noose, and that noose has since been edited out of this cartoon, so you can't find it now. And also, one of the Robin Williams characters in the original version was shown, lifeless body, dead, slumped up against a door. So that's weird. But not only that, a rerun of this episode was running. I think it was like a couple years later, after the episode came out, that Robin Williams died. Okay, but it was about 2 years later. But that episode of The Family Guy was airing on BBC in the UK when news broke that Robin Williams had committed suicide. The story we're being told is that Robin Williams first tried to slice one of his wrists. Oh, and also in the episode, Peter cuts off both his hands because that's how he was going to solve his problem. He couldn't touch anybody else and turn him into, Robin Williams because he chopped off his hands right at his wrists, right? So Robin Williams in real life tried to slice his wrists, and then he hung himself. But in the movie, he hung himself from a door. Now, that sounds like Epstein weird stuff. Like, how do you hang yourself from a door? That's a weird story in and of itself. But that's the official story on Robin Williams. So that's Fat Man and Robin. Let's go. Dark Knight Rises. Okay. So this movie was released on July 16th, 2012. And in the movie, they show a map of Gotham. And in the southernmost triangular part of Gotham, they had a label for Sandy Hook. Now, in the 90s, that same exact area of Gotham was labeled Tricorner Yards. And then in the movies Batman Begins and Gotham Knight, this area was labeled South Hinckley. But in Dark Knight Rises, it was labeled Sandy Hook. This was about 5 months before the mass shooting at Sandy Hook really happened. Okay. Now, I've asked ChatGPT and Grok both. I said, hey, have the words Sandy Hook ever appeared in a movie or television show prior to this? Because I know you're going to shout coincidence. They probably put Sandy Hook in another movie too, and you just, it probably happens all the time. No, there's never been a mention of a Sandy Hook ever in any kind of Hollywood movie or TV show. It's never happened before, just that one time. And then, lo and behold, 5 months later. And apparently the same thing happened with Aurora, but I wasn't able to find any. I tried to find a little bit of stuff on that, but it was a very similar story on that one. Okay, and then the last one I wanted to go over was the China Syndrome. The China Syndrome was a movie about a nuclear reactor meltdown. The movie was released on March the 16th, 1979. 12 days later, the crisis at 3 Mile Island happened in real life. Prior to the China Syndrome, there were no major Hollywood movies made about a nuclear meltdown. There was a TV show made in 1977 called Red Alert that was about a nuclear power plant meltdown in Minnesota that aired on CBS. But other than that, there were never any movies made about nuclear meltdowns. So this is like, this thing doesn't happen and then it happens, and then 12 days later, 3 Mile Island happened in real life. Okay, weird. So then I also wanted to go over 9/11. I'm just going to say it out loud on this podcast. If this gets Google all over me, it gets them on me. Who cares? I did get 133 views on last week's podcast, so thanks for listening, guys. The first one I want to point out, with 9/11, it's a laundry list of stuff that goes on with this one. Now, you can shout coincidence on all of them, and the odds of, 9/11, that date is 1 out of 365. So the odds of seeing this date are literally 1 in 365. But let's go over this. 9/11, the Pentagon. Did you know the groundbreaking ceremony for the Pentagon was held on September 11th, 1941? Strange coincidence. Because remember, I'll refresh your memory, on September 11th, the Pentagon was hit by a Boeing 757, allegedly. The Lone Gunman. This one aired in March of 2001, 6 months before 9/11 happened. It aired on Fox, and the pilot episode of The Lone Gunman, which is a spinoff of The X-Files, it had a rogue government faction, they hijack a Boeing jet airliner with remote controls, and they steer it into the Twin Towers. Now, the plane narrowly misses the towers. It just barely misses. And in that episode, the bad guy explains that this is going to be blamed on Muslim terrorists for the purpose of advancing a political agenda to increase military spending. Wow, what a coincidence. 6 months before the actual event happens. Okay, now this one's really weird. I actually have this book also on my coffee table. It's the book 9/11, written by Thomas Chastain in 1976. This book is about a series of terrorist attacks in New York City. The paperback cover, which is the one I've got, has the word 9/11 on the top. The words are all real, they're black, but what they look like is skyscraper windows, right? So it looks like buildings, skyscrapers, 9/11. And the 11, if you look at that, I mean, it looks just like the Twin Towers. Totally looks like the Twin Towers. And not only that, but there's also, flames on the top of the word 9/11 on this book. Just creepy as all hell. And that was written in 1976. Back to the Future. This one is, to me, mind-blowing. Now, I've shown this to friends, and they just shout coincidence. But if you remember that movie, while Marty is in 1985, he's about to make out with his girlfriend, Jennifer Parker, in the town square when this lady comes up with this jar asking for donations, and she's shouting, "Save the clock tower! Save the clock tower!" Remember that? So she hands Marty a flyer that reads, "Clock tower struck by lightning." Okay, so there we see the words, tower struck. Now, it's in between clock tower struck by and lightning, okay? But those words are on this little brochure that she hands Marty. Tower struck, okay? And in the background of this scene, this is where it gets kind of weird. In the background of that scene, if you pause it, there's a pink building, and I did some research, and apparently the pink building, the occupant of the building was a palm reading, psychic reading place. But it says the, and that's written in cursive. Third is in all caps, and then it has the all-seeing eye of Horus in a pyramid. You know that thing on the back of the dollar, right? Where the top part of the pyramid's disconnected and it's got an eye in there, the all-seeing eye of Providence or whatever. That is in the background of this scene where she's handing him this flyer about the tower being struck. Okay, that's not all though. We're going to keep going with this one. Let's see. Let's move on to the DeLorean. Okay, so Marty and Doc, if you remember, they bring the DeLorean to the mall parking lot in the middle of the night, presumably because the parking lot would be empty and they needed enough space to get that DeLorean up to 88 miles an hour. Remember, that was the magic number that would cause them to time travel. So in this scene, it opens up with a monument sign of the mall. The mall's name is Twin Pines Mall. And right underneath that monument sign, or on the monument sign, is a clock. And that clock was 1:16 in the morning. Now, if you flip that upside down, you get a 9/11, right? Because it was a digital clock, right? So the plan was to send Einstein, the dog, 1 minute into the future, which they did. And before he sends Einstein into the future, Einstein is wearing a lanyard with a stopwatch on it, and Doc's got one too. And he holds them up, and they're both on 1:18. And then, 2 seconds into that scene, they both turn to 1:19 to prove that they're both synced up perfectly, right? Again, 1:19. We have another encoded 9/11, right? Okay. So later in the movie, when Marty returns from 1955, the Twin Pines Mall is now the Lone Pine Mall. So if you go back and watch this movie again, you'll notice it. It's the Twin Pines Mall turning into the Lone Pine Mall. We go from the Twin Towers to the One World Tower, right? Okay. Every time the DeLorean hits 88 miles per hour, it goes through time travel, but it always leaves in its wake flaming tire tracks in the scene. So in the scene in 1955, where Marty hits the wire that's strung up to the clock tower, if you pay attention to that scene, right after he time travels, Doc is walking down the middle of the flaming tire tracks, and they zoom out, and what you see is on the left side of the screen, you see a Western Auto. And it's got an arrow pointed at the store. It's a yellow arrow. but the arrow is all curved around, like in a circle almost, but it's a 9. So you got the 9 over there on the left side of the scene, and then you got the flaming tire tracks making the 11. There's another 9/11 encoded in that movie. And then while Marty is still in 1955, remember he decided to write Doc a letter, and he put it in an envelope that said, "Do not open until 1985." And of course, the letter inside the envelope was a warning about a Muslim terrorist attack. Remember? So then, during the hectic scene with the storm coming in and the branch falling down and everything, Doc finds the letter that Marty had slipped in his coat pocket. He says, "What's the meaning of this?" And Marty replies, "Find out in 30 years." Okay? Now, the maker of this movie, the director, is a guy named Robert Zemeckis. And he also put some 9/11 stuff in the third trilogy to that as well, but I'm not going to go over that. So Robert Zemeckis releases Back to the Future in 1985, and wouldn't you know it, exactly 30 years later, he made another movie in 2015. And the name of that movie was The Walk. I don't know if any of you guys saw it, if you remember it, but The Walk is a movie about the Twin Towers. In the movie, a guy sneaks in to wire it up, right? So he can do a tightrope walk between the two buildings. That's an awful lot of coincidence, if you ask me. Okay, let's go over the coup. Just days before 9/11, there was a party album, one of those. It was a party album mix, and it was entitled "The Coup." And this came out just right before 9/11. And if you look at this, if you Google that, you'll see it on Google Images. The cover shows the Twin Towers exploding with massive explosions coming out of the towers at about the same heights where Flight 11 and 175 entered those towers. It's just downright creepy to see this. And that was days before 9/11. Okay, 30 Seconds Over New York. This one's weird. This was written by Robert Buchard in 1970. The paperback cover shows a Boeing 707 flying at low altitude headed directly for the Twin Towers. Cracked Magazine. The July cover of 1975. It shows the Twin Towers with flames shooting out at several stories below the top of the building. Very similar to where Flight 175 entered the North Tower. There's also a commercial jet airliner crashing into the top of the building just above where the flames are. Illuminati card game, 1995. I looked into this one. I didn't even know this was a real thing, but there was a game that came out in 1995. They called it the Illuminati card game. One of the cars shows the Twin Towers with an explosion coming out of the side of the tower at about the same height where Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower. Another card shows the Pentagon being bombed. Okay. A Long Kiss Goodnight, 1996, featuring Samuel L. Jackson and Gina Davis. So in this one, there's this high-ranking CIA guy, and he's explaining that the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was known in advance by the CIA. And then he goes on to explain how they have plans for a false flag attack where thousands of New Yorkers will die, and the attacks will be blamed on Muslim terrorists. 7 Days. In Season 2, Episode 2, it aired on October 6, 1999. A guided missile strikes the Pentagon, causing damage to one side of the building. Now, this one's a cartoon, but the damage looks almost identical to what we saw on 9/11, with heavy damage to the E-ring and nearly no damage to the C, B, or A rings. City of New York versus Homer Simpson. This is a really weird one too. So in this episode, it aired September 21st, 1997. It was Season 9, Episode 1. Lisa holds up an advertisement about a bus trip to New York City. The ad says $9, and it's got the Twin Towers in the background. And that's where Bart shouts out, $9, this one's on me. But if you read it from left to right, this little ad as she's holding it up, I mean, the $9, 9, and then the Twin Towers make the 11, 9/11. Really, really weird if you ask me. Newsweek, 1967, David Rockefeller. Now, this guy was the president of Chase Manhattan Bank, and I would imagine being the president of Chase Manhattan Bank, he's probably one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. He was very instrumental in the development of the World Trade Center. So this guy is on the cover of Newsweek magazine in 1967 with the North Tower right behind him, and he's got a wristwatch in this shot. He's wearing a wristwatch, and if you zoom in on it, you can see that the wristwatch is set to 8:55. Now it's not a digital watch, so we had an hour hand pointed at the 9 and the minute hand pointed at the 11. Another encoded 9/11 with the Twin Towers in the background. Breakfast in America with Supertramp, 1979. If you'll type that into Google, you'll see what I'm talking about. There's a waitress, and she's standing in front of New York City with the Twin Towers in the background. Now, immediately above the Twin Towers are the letters U and P of Supertramp. So if you invert that and go backwards, right above those Twin Towers you have a 9/11. Terminator 2. And the 1992 movie Terminator 2. Now, in this one, there's a scene where a Freightliner tow truck crashes into an overpass, and on that overpass is the words caution 9/11. It was 9 feet 11 inches, but it says 9 apostrophe and then 11 with the quotation marks, so 9/11. It's printed right on the side of the bridge, and then they show fuel leaking out of the truck, and then the truck explodes. Now, this was in the LA flood channels where they're all concrete. I know there's been a lot of movies filmed in these things. I asked Grok and ChatGPT, I said, hey, what are the odds that this director of this movie would choose a location with a 9/11 on the height of the overpass? And it assessed those odds at about 1 in 100. It's a very low odds. Very, very, very unlikely that they would have chosen, that overpass with that height. Pirelli, a 1998 Pirelli tire ad featured Brazilian soccer superstar Ronaldo Luis Nazario with his back turned to the camera, and he's posed as Christ the Redeemer, like the statue in Rio de Janeiro. He's wearing his jersey number 9, and he's standing next to the Twin Towers, which look like an 11. So we have another encoded 9/11, and under the slogan, power is nothing without control. Not saying that everybody at Pirelli's in on it, but they hired an advertising firm. Who really knows? But that was what year was that? That was 1998, so 3 years before it happened. Armageddon. In the 1998 movie, a scene shows the Twin Towers with the top blown off of one of them about the same height as where Flight 11 entered the North Tower. And on the other tower, it has a section missing on the side of the other tower, and it's a bit lower, and that was about the same height as where Flight 175 entered the South Tower. Godzilla, 1998. Matthew Broderick checks his watch, and the time is 8:55. Just like with David Rockefeller, the hour hand is pointed at the 9, minute hand is pointed at the 11. The movie is set in New York City. It makes reference to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and it has several scenes depicting the Twin Towers. Matrix, released in 1999. There's a scene where it shows the passport. The passport is upside down. If you turn it upside and look and zoom in carefully, the expiration date of this passport is September 11th, 2001. Another coincidence. The Patriot. Now, one thing we got out of 9/11 was the Patriot Act. This movie was released in 2000, and in the opening scene, Mel Gibson is weighing a rocking chair when he says, 9 pounds, 11 ounces. What do you know? Andy Griffith Show, Season 4, Episode 11. I think I went over this one a little bit in the last podcast. There's a scene where Barney pulls over Gomer, and he shouts, I'm writing you up for a 9/11. The season aired shortly after Kennedy was assassinated, and in that episode, they mocked the citizen's arrest. The other point of that is you have those 2 dialing codes. Remember, 411 for information. So this was your information, and then 911 emergency, right? So that was Season 4, Episode 11 of the Andy Griffith Show. There's also The Big Lebowski, released in 1998. There's a scene where Jeff Bridges is writing a check for 69 cents at the Ralph's grocery store, as he's writing the check, he dates the check September 11th. And as he's writing the check, there's a TV above the cashier that they show, and George Bush is making a speech to rally up the people for the purpose of invading Iraq. So, this stuff is just, you can shout coincidence on all that stuff, but it's more coincidence than I can accept. To me, there's something going on. I don't know if it's just this weird place we're in that we call Earth that makes these weird things happen, or who knows? I mean, I just can't write all this stuff off to coincidence. And so when I see one of the powerful people on CNBC ringing the opening bell, when we've got that saying, nobody rings a bell, and he's ringing the bell on the New York Stock Exchange, and the next day is October 29th, and this book behind him was about the October 29 stock market crash, 1029. I don't know. It's going to be really weird if all three of these major stock market indexes hit their all-time high on October 29th, the day after he rang that bell. We'll see what happens. So that's it for today. I appreciate you guys listening. I'm sorry I didn't go over any more baseball betting stuff. There's more too that I could add on the next podcast. I'll go over some more baseball stuff. But for this time, this one's just about the behemoth bubble, and we didn't even go over Vegas banks. But that's it for today, and thanks for listening, and we'll be back with the next podcast. Thank you.